Okay. So we are in Mark chapter 9, starting at verse 14 tonight. As I mentioned, this is the next thing that happens when the disciples and Jesus come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. We'll talk about Jesus healing this boy who had an evil spirit, possessed by a demon. And there should be more than enough for us to discuss just in this one story for tonight. So let's go ahead. We'll get started. We'll start reading at verse 14. And then read up to verse, 29. And that's where we'll stop for tonight. And we'll see how much of this we can discuss in our time this evening. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "O unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, he immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for him who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the evil spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." And we'll stop there because the next few verses really take us into the next topic. So tonight, just talking about this healing of the boy with an evil spirit. And so the scene begins with Jesus, Peter, James, John coming back to the other disciples. And when he finds them, they're here arguing with the teachers of the law, and there's a crowd around them. And obviously you can understand why there might have been a little commotion with all of this going on. And so our first two questions really talk about this opening as we examine the scene, as we observe the scene. The first question is this: what kind of moment opened an opportunity for Jesus' opponents to try to cause doubt among his disciples? What kind of an event happened? What kind of moment? What had happened to these other disciples? Nancy?
They weren't able to cast out or get the spirit out of the boy.
Yeah, so it was a moment where things didn't go according to plan. We might say in a real broad way. They were not able to cast out this spirit. We know that earlier Jesus had sent out the disciples to preach and to teach and to heal and drive out demons. So it's not like they haven't been able to do this before. But now here's an opportunity, or here's a place where they tried something and it did not go as they had expected. And so the point really of asking this question is that we see that when it's when things don't go according to plan, that all of a sudden there's where the door is open for doubt. And the teachers of the law, being opponents of Jesus, and of course anyone who would follow him, would have seized upon that, right? Oh, you guys believe in Jesus, or you think that following this Jesus guy is so great. Well, look what happened. You thought that this was working out great for you guys, but you couldn't drive out this spirit. Maybe your power's gone. And Jesus wasn't there either, so think about how that might have played into it too. You guys rely on Jesus, and when you have this problem, he's not even around to help you. So the point being that so often for us as well, when do those doubts come in? When do those voices that attack us and our faith start to get a little bit louder? It's when things aren't going so well. When things aren't going according to plan, aren't going the way that we'd like them to go or expect them to go, that the doubts really start to come and attack. But read through the whole rest of the story, and we see that there was no reason for them not to believe or to doubt at any point. So there's the reminder for us, right? As we examine at the beginning, where was the opportunity for doubt? It was there when we find ourselves failing, but Christ doesn't fail. Any other thoughts, comments, response to that? Let's look at the next question then, question 2, just to keep things moving along. Why should we notice that the people are happy to see Jesus? Now, we got this commotion going on. There's, we might say, 3 groups of people: disciples, teachers of the law, and then just kind of bystanders. And when Jesus shows up, they're happy to see Jesus. What reason, or what things are notable about that? Myron?
I would think people that believed in Jesus would know that he could help them.
Yeah, so that's definitely a big one. Is, you know, the boy has not yet been helped, and well, here's Jesus. So here comes the solution. Yeah. What else is notable about seeing this reaction, Mark?
Also, if you take into account that the religious leaders there were casting all these doubts to these people. Well, now he's come, so no longer I have any of this problem, because now he's here and he'll save the day.
Yeah. So whether it's the disciple,
I think that the disciples were feeling really bad that they couldn't help.
yeah. So a relief for the disciples, and for some of the other people, maybe we're finally going to get to the bottom of this. And I do have another point that I want to make, and I don't know if we'd get there just through answers. So those were both good answers, but part of that too is that in both of those answers, the solution is Jesus. The solution's not in the disciples and the teachers of the law arguing, no matter how pious their arguments may have been. The solution is in Jesus. And so maybe more as an application and less of what we're observing the story, but just an application is for us too. We ought to remember that who we want to look at is Jesus. And when it comes to dealing with other people's problems or arguments, don't get caught up in the problem or the argument, but let them see Jesus. We can think of some other times too, where the Gospels remind us, don't get caught up in this other stuff, but see Jesus. And of course, that means understand who he is and the salvation he brings and the solutions that come through that. But you think of the men who come to the disciples and say, "Sir, we would like to see Jesus." That's one that's often brought up as a reminder. But this stands out too, right? There's the solution for that boy. There's the solution to the failure, the bad feelings maybe that the disciples were going through. And to get to the bottom of it, Jesus is that solution. Anything else on that one? Myron?
I don't think, when Jesus, the lepers, what was it, 10, 12, whatever they were, he healed them, and only one comes back to thank him. Now, these others, I don't think they had any faith, or else they would all come back and thank him for, making them clean.
Yeah, the one recognizes what's really been done for him and who's done it.
Or healed them. Yeah, so what?
Yeah.
And perhaps the religious leaders really thought that this was a moment that they were going to prove that he wasn't all that.
Yeah. Maybe they thought, well, Jesus is here, but if his disciples couldn't do what they've done before, maybe now we finally got Jesus. But we see that's not the case. As we move on, let's look a little bit at the description of this boy's condition. So we get a little bit of the description at the first part of the story. Jesus, asks a general question: "What are you arguing about with them?" And then we see that it's actually the boy's father whose words we get to hear. He's the one who tells him what's going on. "I brought my son." He was obviously looking for Jesus, didn't find him, but saw the disciples and figured, well, since Jesus is not here, they can help. And he describes it. When the spirit seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. And then a little later on in verse 22, he adds to that the fact that often it has thrown him into fire or water to kill him. What should this description of demon possession remind us or make us think about?
Power.
Yeah, the power of whom?
The devil.
Yeah, the devil. And so the reminder there that this is serious stuff. Don't mess around with the devil and with demons. And so certainly, we might, things that are labeled as part of the occult, right? Dealing with spirits and all of that stuff, but also it carries with it that constant reminder that sin itself is serious. You open the door to sin and you go down the path of temptation, and suddenly you find yourself trapped more and more in it. And let this be a very vivid and visual reminder of how serious anything associated with sin and the devil is. And certainly the devil wants people trapped in sin. And so even though every situation is not physically or outwardly this grotesque and terrifying and difficult, spiritually it is. And here's a place where you really get a picture of that with the way that physically the demon tormented this boy. And Jesus' response to this, verse 19, is to say, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" How can he call the people, including those disciples who had confessed him to be Christ and followed him, an unbelieving generation? Or just more broadly, what is his point in saying, "Oh, unbelieving generation"? They were sinners, and so certainly none of this would be going on if they were not sinners. What else? But that's a great start in answering this question.
He's been teaching them all along, and still, they haven't reached that level.
Yeah, so in some real particular and specific application to these people, one, realize that, you're sinful people living in a sinful world, but to point out that this failure and this commotion and this confusion about it, in particular with the disciples, but really in general of all those people, there is evidence that though they've been listening to Jesus and though they have faith in him, they still have signs of unbelief. There's weakness there. And again, kind of like we've talked about with Jesus saying to Peter, when Peter was telling him, "No, Lord, you aren't going to die. Get behind me, Satan." Those things are sinful thoughts. Here it is. He's saying this weakness of faith is signs of unbelief. So just showing how serious it is, what they lack. Not accusing them of not being believers, but of showing them, if you think that you've come all the way, you aren't there. Good answer. Other thoughts about that?
Must have been frustrating to Jesus.
And yet we see what incredible patience he has. And while certainly it troubles him, when we see times where he expresses the frustration in the sense that it's troubled him, he never becomes impatient. He never gets upset like we certainly would. You try to teach someone a lesson and they don't pick up. I'm sorry.
Because
Exactly. Yeah, because he is holy. Yeah. Terry.
Well, I was just going to say that it's a real teaching moment for them. And maybe one of those things they will remember.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jesus, very much makes that a teaching moment for them. We'll see a little bit later. We'll focus in on the teaching moment that he had particularly for the father of that boy too. And you say a teaching moment, and some of the other things that were mentioned give us a nice transition into question 5. What is the point of the warning in the words, "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" It says, "Oh, unbelieving generation," but then he also adds, "How long? How long?" Until we get it, but also that reminder that there is no putting this off, right? Because there is a timeline. First of all, I guess we could say for these people, Jesus was only going to be there for so long. Second, maybe we put on that list that a person's life is only so long to hear these things and listen to them. And the world itself only lasts so long as well.
And rejection of Jesus, I mean, that can't be infinite that you're doing that.
Right. The rejection of Jesus can't be infinite that you do that. And so, he's highlighting unbelief. What is unbelief? And then he's saying you can't go on, but the patience is still there underneath all of that. And the love as he teaches. So they bring the boy to Jesus, as he asked them to do. Immediately, the Spirit throws the boy into one of these convulsions. Another little nugget of information for us that shows us this truly was what Mark records it as being demon possession, not just a medical condition of an ordinary type, because we see how the Spirit reacts in particular to Jesus. And Jesus asks the boy's father, how long has he been like this? Why does Jesus ask that question? What purpose is there in that?
It's a real thing. He can't have been taking it since he was born.
Yeah, so it's just more of that pointing out what the reality of the situation is, and then giving evidence to the fact that this is going to be a miracle of God. If you've been coming to the Sunday Bible classes, I know many of you have been there. We heard about the man that Peter and John healed who was lame, and we heard similar kind of details about him, right? He was that way from birth, and he was 40 years old at the time he was healed. So again, it's not faking it. Just the other day, I was reading in the Gospel of John as well, and I think it's verse 9 is the familiar story of Jesus healing the man born blind. And I think that one's familiar, and we remember it because if you recall, it begins with Jesus' disciples saying, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was blind? And Jesus says that it was neither. This is so that the God would be glorified. And of course, he heals him. And it's, if you read that whole account, it actually it goes from the man born blind, Jesus healing him, to this man gets brought in before some of the leaders, and they ask him a bunch of questions. Who did this? And then they even bring in that man's parents, and they're like, is this really your son? Has he been blind since birth? And they say, yeah, but we don't know who healed him. And then the guy says, well, it was Jesus who healed me. And it's actually pretty remarkable what he says at that point. He's like, well, do you guys want to be his disciples too? They get kind of mad about that. And then it transitions into Jesus talking about being the good shepherd. So kind of a great part there. But the point is, as it relates to us here in Mark, is here's evidence that this, again, is the work of God, overcoming this condition that's been going on for years. And I think we could say, too, probably just from a personal aspect, is that Jesus is dealing with this father. That's what we would ask if we were helping someone, isn't it? What's going on here? How long has it been like this? To really know and understand the man's situation. I think there's some comfort in that as well. Jesus really does care, and he really wants all the details, and then he will give the solution.
Well, and he's Jesus, so he knows how long it's been going on. But he's letting the people there.
Right. Letting people there know, letting the father know. Yep, absolutely.
I can't imagine being the parents of a child that I just can't even imagine. It was been exhausting.
Yeah. Well, you can think of with the preschool and with the one that we have who will constantly run for doors and how tiring that is to now imagine when it's throwing him into, and too, Nancy, into fire and into water.
I think it's, illustrated like this to help us to understand that it wasn't just a kind of a trickery thing that had happened.
Sure.
That it really wasn't lifelong.
Yeah.
Something.
Wasn't just set up for Jesus to come here and show up these people with a trick that was pre-planned. Absolutely. Let's focus in here as we get to our last few minutes on Jesus interacting with this father here, because this really is, in many ways, the high point of the story. So as the father tells Jesus what what the condition has been, he ends by saying, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus replies, "If you can, everything is possible for him who believes." What is Jesus teaching the man by responding to his statement by saying, "If you can, everything is possible for the one who believes"? Pointing out his question or his hesitation there, and then responding with that statement. What's Jesus' point? Mark.
Clearly, by asking Jesus if he can, of course he can. So if he had complete belief, that would not be a question in his mind. Certainly he can. And Jesus pointing out, hey, you just got to believe.
Yeah, so it's going back to that thing about unbelief, and he's showing that man, like you said, he's showing to him, a complete belief is not asking if you can, but it's knowing that you can. And so, you might think he first brought the boy to come to Jesus, but now there's this hesitation. Teaching him now on a personal level, not just addressing the crowd, not just the disciple, but this man. That hesitation, that's unbelief. And Jesus is going to overcome that. And we see in the man's response, right? That's who he relies on, is Jesus, right? I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Very clear. Other answer or response to that. Otherwise, you can keep thinking about that. But the next few questions are still about this topic, so we can mix in all our answers with that. But the next two questions, maybe we ought to take them together. And unfortunately, one is on one side of the paper, one's on the other. But what is the, or how would it be possible to misunderstand that statement? Jesus says everything is possible for him who believes, especially if we take it out of context. And then the follow-up naturally is, what is the right way to understand what Jesus says when he says everything is possible for him who believes?
Well, there's no limit, because you believe in the Lord, then he will fight for you.
Yeah.
He will comfort you in your sorrow.
Yeah. So the fact of the matter is, the truth, the big truth above all of this is that God absolutely can do whatever he sees fit. And so there really is no need to worry or to wonder in any situation, because as you said, he's able to comfort our sorrow, all of them. And we'll kind of work our way to this some more, but the big point is, as he sees fit in his good and gracious will, his perfect knowledge. But let's talk some more things. Terry, I saw your hand up, and then we'll go Mark.
I was just gonna say, on the bad side of things, if you put it that the person doesn't believe enough, and then he won't be healed.
Yeah.
And, I think back to all the TV shows I've seen where you just didn't believe enough, or somebody, did believe enough, and then the person got up and walked. Stuff like that. So.
Yeah. So one danger in misinterpreting it is to put the power in the person's belief and not in the object of their belief, which is Christ. And there you're making it something that the person is doing, and there's a failure. Mark?
I was kind of going exactly what you were
Yeah.
saying. The end is, your worldly desires does not trump God's will.
Yeah.
So if you do misinterpret this, you can find yourself in a situation where if it doesn't happen exactly according to what your will as a human, that you can completely lose faith.
Yeah. So another thing important to keep in mind, Mark says, your human desires do not trump God's will, which means it doesn't mean that, well, I believe God, so whatever I want to happen ought to happen. Yeah.
I was at a neighborhood Bible study years ago. There was a new Christian in that group, so it was kind of an exciting Bible study. But there was a neighbor who had cancer. And this group of gals decided that they would pray for him and that he would be well. Well, he did go into remission, but not for that long. The man's faith was crushed and so was theirs.
Yeah. And so if you do misinterpret it, rather than it being a strengthening thing as it ought, and like you said, it can be something that crushes and it falls apart, because really the faith is then founded on human things, isn't it? Kind of coming back to what Terry had first mentioned. That in that kind of situation, that kind of interpretation, the onus is really on the person. You got to believe. You got to do this. Well, that's not even what's contained in that man's answer, is it? I do believe. That's just acknowledgement of the fact, but help me overcome my unbelief. Not, I do believe, I'm going to work on my unbelief, Lord. No, you help me overcome my unbelief. Complete reliance on Christ. That's where he needs that strength from. Anyone else on that? Get more thoughts? I had a few points that before I get to the points that I wanted to say, let's look at question 10. So that statement that the man makes, we've talked about a little bit. I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. How might we put such a statement to use in our own lives? Anne?
Well, I'm just thinking about things that have happened in my life, and people have said stuff that's, something happens and you don't really understand it, but it's like, well, that must not be God's plan for me right now, or, there must be something else going on, or, and just to keep that in mind, that whatever happens, good, bad, or indifferent, God's in control, and just remember that, just because it's not what you want right this minute may not be what you need.
Yeah, and so maybe to answer that, or as you think of answers for yourself to that, we kind of go back to what we opened with and saying, what are those times where we find ourselves most vulnerable to doubts, or vulnerable to those attacks that the world or a sinful nature would present against us as Christians. And those are the times where we really need to turn to Jesus. Mark?
I can't pretend to try to understand exactly what this man is saying, but if what he's saying by helping me overcome my unbelief, he's obviously sought help for this child for a long time. He's even brought him to the disciples who were unsuccessful. So therefore, overcoming his unbelief is the healing of his son. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition into one of the points that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that I had noted too, is you think about some of the things in life that seem impossible, and they seem impossible, so you don't even know how you're going to begin to approach to deal with them, like this man with his son. And in particular, I can think of some that maybe as Christians relate directly to spiritual things. And I highlight that in particular because there we can say some very certain things about it. But one that I would say is in a world that is increasingly becoming ungodly, oftentimes we might look at it and think, well, how can I go on? How can the church go on? Maybe you know of someone who's not a believer or who struggles with something, and you might wonder, how could they ever believe, right? How could they ever leave that sin behind that has such a grasp on them, or that they have such a grasp in? Think of some of the, you might say, more popular sins of our day that have to do with sexual sins, lifestyle things, or just there's a lot of things that would fit in that category. But as you think about that and how prevalent it is in this world, might you not see them as being impossible objects? But what is that? Unbelief. That Christ can't overcome those things, that person that I'm thinking of, that I could never see them being a believer, because no, that's exactly what Christ overcomes. And so there's a spot. Help me overcome my unbelief. I do believe, obviously, we obviously know Christ. We know the things about him to be true, and we even have trust in him. But how often isn't it lacking? Not complete. And that brings to one of the other points too that I wanted to mention, is that oftentimes the theologians will talk about faith in its definition as being broken into three things. one, we know that faith is more than just knowing about Jesus, but there is knowledge, right? You do have to know who Jesus is. The second part that they call assent, not just knowing, but also this is true, right? The Holy Spirit has brought me to believe that these things are true, and then a confidence that these things which I've been brought to know are true have an impact on me. And so that's one way of kind of breaking down what faith is. We know faith comes from hearing the message. It's the gift of God. It's knowing about Jesus, believing in him, trusting in him. But if we were going to break it down into a certain understandable way for us as humans, it's knowing those facts, believing them to be true, and then the trust that goes along with them. And when we understand that too, we can maybe a little bit better understand these moments of weakness or the moments where there's unbelief, while also understanding that doesn't mean we've become unbelievers. Follow up to that, thoughts that you might have. Yes.
I just think of what's heaven like? We don't know. What happens when we die? You have to face that thought. Many times, it's not a matter of, I'm going to heaven, I'll be with the Lord. But you're fearful because it's an absolute unknown. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Yep. There's a good place for that to be applied. Facing death.
Which we haven't done before.
Right. And which is that one unavoidable thing which each one of us must face. So it is a big deal. And it's a big deal to have Christ. One last quote that I wanted to read from a commentary on this that helps us with this. All things that God has promised in his word to believers are possible for believers. If one does not believe the promises, of course, he will not receive what is promised. And Scripture says as much, too, in the first chapter of James. We're encouraged to ask God for these things, these spiritual things. But it also says if one does not ask with confidence, how is he going to expect to receive them? But we do have confidence because we have the promises of God. Last two questions here as we finish up. Focus on the resolution to this story. As the crowd is gathering, Jesus doesn't want to just do this for the sake of showing off, so he's going to get to business, and he rebukes the evil spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up to his feet, and he stood up. What do you notice about the difference between the conduct of the demon when Jesus drives him out in comparison to the manner in which Jesus commands him to leave? Excuse me. Anne?
I'm not sure if this is fairly good or not, but I'm just thinking the demon is like, stop that. He's got one little poke before he leaves. He's like, I've got one more little tiny shot before I'll take off.
Yeah, so we see that the demon, just as his entire conduct has been in the time that he's tormented this boy, is to just be as ostentatious as possible, be as loud and as boisterous as possible. Yeah, to get that one last, strike in, but he knows he's powerless. But the point being, so often, right, isn't that the way that sinful things are? Is they're the loud, the flashy, the things that cause the most noise, and that's how Satan is. He's out here. He's wild. He's attacking things without, any regard, without any real plan in many cases. And yet there's Jesus, right? Calm, assertive. Definitely, I command you, come out of him. But that the quiet, and not necessarily that there was a whisper or anything, but the understated authority. And so you see the contrast. All of the commotion, the wildness, the craziness of sin and the devil, the calmness, directness, authority in the word of Jesus. So, something to take note of. And the last part then. Later, when Jesus and his disciples were indoors, out of this public place, the disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." What do we learn from Jesus' answer to his disciples about why they couldn't drive out this demon? Myron?
Maybe they didn't believe that they had the power to do it. But the power come from Jesus when they were out on their other mission.
Yeah, so one thing here, I think once again we see that theme of, well, what is unbelief?
Yeah.
Were they, we're not told specific details about their failure or anything, but it's clear that it wasn't something they couldn't have done, but there clearly was not that complete trust there. And with that, maybe even the knowledge. And I think that's the second thing. And just since we're short on time, I'll say that is the second thing we see here is that there is a lack of knowledge among the disciples and among us, right? They don't know everything about their opponent, the demons. And so maybe there's a reminder for us there too. Jesus does say this kind can come out only by prayer. So there is more, I guess you'd say, detail to the nature of these demons. But yeah, it really does come back to that point of they come out by prayer. The power is with Jesus, and they failed, and at that point it probably seems like they gave up, and they're like, oh well, what do we do now? Instead of continuing or more even more fervently, asking God to help. Oh, we couldn't do this. We need God's help even more than we thought at the beginning of this, maybe that sort of thing. So I think very good. That would be an important point to take away as we close this section. Any last thoughts or comments about Jesus healing this demon-possessed boy? Jean?
I think sometimes too with prayer, maybe even just if maybe it wasn't God's plan to take out that demon. And so then also to pray that you can understand what is going on, what is his purpose.
Sure. Yeah, that prayer is always, your will be done. Good. Let's close with prayer this evening. Dear Lord Jesus, we ask that in our lives you would help us overcome our unbelief and guide us in lives of service to you and give us boldness and confidence as we go into this world that does oppose us, that would like to take opportunities, to take shots at us and to get us to doubt, but to continue to keep us in your care, that we keep our trust in you completely, never faltering, never failing, and that we always would act or would wish to act according to your Father's will in heaven. All these things we pray in your name. Amen.